Thank you, everybody, for coming to this session on Latin America. Specifically today, we'll be talking about socialism in Latin America, about this struggle and this fight that all our nations have between capitalism, freedom, and socialism, between democracy and dictatorship. A fight that is in every one of our nations, from Mexico with the government of López Obrador to Argentina with the governments of Fernández. But a fight that the epicenter of this fight is actually our country, is Venezuela. My nation, the nation I come from, for the last 2 decades have been under the rule of an authoritarian socialist regime, a regime that took all of our freedoms, a regime that took a prosperous and free nation into the worst humanitarian crisis of the history of the Western Hemisphere. That even worse, a regime that, coming from the Soviet tradition, then export this ideology, export this way of authoritarian governance to countries like Bolivia, Nicaragua, Honduras, and so on. So right now, if we see a snapshot of Latin America, then we will see socialist governments in most of our nations. Even in countries like Colombia, countries that in the last decades we had moderate governance, now they are ruled by a former guerrilla member of Petro, named Gustavo Petro. And even countries like Chile, where the last decades it was the country with the most successful period of economic development. So that's the situation right now in Latin America. So I believe that what we have to do is to divide this session in two. The first thing that all of us needs to try to address and understand is what are the causes of this? Why do in Latin America keep voting and believing in socialist ideas? Why? And after addressing that, then the most important question, what can we do about it? What can we do so that in 10 years, when we have another panel together, and when we reunite with all of you also from Latin America as well, then our panel is not about the failure of our nations, but about the successes, but about the miracle that our countries are experiencing. Because that's what I want, that in 10 years, then we talk about Venezuela, not about the migration, not about the horrors that are going on in my country, but about the miracle, but about a country with dignity again, with human rights again, a country in which all of our freedoms are protected by our Constitution, and a country in which rulers and politicians are serving the people and not themselves and their corruption. So that's the way this session will go. And my first question to Marta is, of course, in your experience, what do you think about the Latin American relationship with socialism? Why do we believe in it? Why do we have this tendency?
Well, that's a great question. So first off, I think that socialism is an easy sell, right? People who have not lived under it especially fall prey to it, and I think we see that currently happening here in this country in America. And that is that it's like a romantic movie. It's like a Disney fantasy, right? We're going to provide everything for you. We're all going to be equal. Everything is going to be wonderful. But the reality, like a relationship, you know, when you see one on TV, it's beautiful. And then the real world application of that is something a little different. And that is that it takes work and that it takes more than. You cannot just have a government come in and give you everything. It doesn't work that way. And so they sell that idea, and it sounds great, but in the application, it's never worked. And then there's also the other half of this. It's not just the selling point of it. It is that Cuba and Fidel Castro has had this mission, this plan for all of Latin America for the last 63 years, and that was to turn all of Latin America into a united type of USSR. This isn't something that I'm coming up with. You can hear about it yourself in Fidel Castro's own words. He wanted something like this, and he has been planning it. He trained Hugo Chavez. He trained Petro. And these are things, and he had a big part in Nicaragua. He has a big part in FARC, which is Colombia. This is something that has been planned and put into motion. So you have a plan that has been executed very well, and then you have this idea that is very easy to sell. So it's almost twofold. It's almost like the perfect storm came together and is now what we're seeing. I grew up in Venezuela. I'm not Venezuelan, I'm Cuban. And Cuba's very much invaded Venezuela. And that country that was prosperous and was at the time in the 80s, one of the most prosperous nations in Latin America is now one of the poorest. And that is the thing that I try to emphasize to people who talk about socialism here in the United States. You just can't, it's not the recipe. It's not the chef that introduces this recipe. It's the recipe that's broken. Socialism has never worked. It will never work.
Daniel, same question for you.
Yeah, well, I think that first it's important to remark, why does this matter to Americans, right? And I think that Latin America is such an important case for us because in most of these Latin American countries, people voted for these governments that are destroying their own nations. And if that's ever going to happen in the United States, it's going to be because there's a democratic election where people vote people into office that start implementing massive regulations, massive taxation that ends up stagnating our economies and leading into this cycle of we vote a socialist into power, then somebody else comes in, then they don't do things right again, and then a socialist comes again into power. And that's what we're seeing in Argentina, and that's what we're seeing now in Colombia, and we're seeing it in Chile and everywhere else. So Martha touched in an important cause. There is an international strategy of socialist regimes like Cuba, now Venezuela, Nicaragua, who sponsor political parties abroad that give them money, like this is actual, financing to destabilize other countries. Cuba does this. Venezuela gave money to Podemos, which is a political party in power in Spain. Chavez, as part of the Foro de Sao Paulo, which is an international organization of socialist parties, they meet every year to organize how to take over new countries. Like this is like an open conspiracy. And that's one side, but the other cause is that the right and the liberals, properly understood, classical liberals in Latin America, don't do well when they get elected. Or the oppositions, when they get elected, they really don't do much. We saw what happened in Argentina. Macri took over after Cristina Fernandez. And what did he do? Inflation stayed in 20, 30%. And Argentinians, after 4 years, were, this guy disappointed us. So let's vote the same people that destroyed our country in the first place back in. And in Bolivia, they had an opportunity with Janet Núñez. And what happened was that she organized new elections, and the Bolivians voted again for the socialists. So how do we break that cycle? And this is even outside of Venezuela, where we don't even have the choice to vote. I'm from Venezuela. I came to the United States 6 years ago, and it all started democratically. So how do we stop America and other countries from entering into that cycle in the first place? And I think that the answer to that is that we need to make sure this country and other countries are prosperous, so that people never feel the need to vote for socialists in the first place. If Venezuela had been prosperous in the 90s, if there hadn't been crises, because Venezuela was okay, of course, by today's standards, people were not starving, but it was not okay either. There was a crisis, there was still high inflation, not hyperinflation, but things were not all right. And that's why people felt the need to vote for Hugo Chavez in the beginning. So we need to stop those conditionings from happening in the first place.
Of course, and this is something that I want to emphasize, what Daniel was saying, is that if people vote for somebody, it's because there was a necessity. It's because they felt that their voices were not being heard. It's because of their struggles. They saw that their political system or the political elites were not listening to them. And as you said, in Venezuela, when Chavez got elected, and as Daniel said, he got elected, it was not a coup d'etat, in the late 90s, we came in Venezuela from 2 decades of economic stagnation. We came from Venezuela, we grew a lot from the 1920s to the 1980s. In fact, we were the country that grew the most rapid way during those decades. We grew by almost 7% per year per capita. And then after that, in the 1980s and in the 1990s, for several reasons, our countries did not grow. Venezuela did not grow. So because of that, then poverty rose, and at the same time, people felt that the system was betraying them. So when that happens, then the power vacuum is often filled by populists, by people who tell them that by overthrowing the system, by giving them omnipotent powers, then they will be able to solve all the problems of the nation. And that's something that happened in Venezuela. And then when they are in power, they tend to, for example, rewrite constitutions. And again, we are seeing the same, for example, in Chile, in a different perspective, in the sense that Chile was growing very rapidly until, in fact, the reforms of Bachelet a few years ago.
Yeah.
And then when the progress does not continue, then the same people who create the problem, then the most radical part of that wing then try to offer the solutions, and try to offer the solutions based on a new constitution, for example, which is something that all of us should reject. You also touch on a very important topic in the sense that when we have the opportunity to govern in Latin America, we have to govern well. And governing well, I think, has two elements on it. The first one is the technical elements, and you're doing a PhD on economics. You know how difficult it is to find and to achieve economic development. But when we have the chance to be in government and to do reforms, we have to do them. You mentioned the problems of Macri, and we can all, for example, talk about the problems of the 1990s in Latin America, where all our countries try to apply reforms and they fail. And the second aspect of that is the aspect of communication, which I want to ask you, Marta, because you have been talking to people from all over Miami in these last months. And me, from afar, from living, not even in the US, I live in Madrid now, I saw your success. I saw that during your campaign, you were able to touch something. And again, this is the second aspect of governing, is to listening to people, empathize with people. Because if people vote for populists and socialists, it's not because they're stupid. They vote because they see in them a solution. And our challenge in our movement, what we have to do, is to be that solution, to empathize with them, to talk to them, and to tell them that the solution is not the populists. The solution is to give them freedom, but to actually give them freedom. So my question to you is, how can we talk to people? How can we communicate the ideas of a free society?
That's a fantastic question. And the reality is, people don't learn from other people's experience. And you can see that all around in Miami. We are surrounded, literally surrounded by people who have come to this city, this county, from places like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Colombia, like Nicaragua. And they tell their stories, and they tell about these governments that are oppressive, these regimes, really. And yet, people will still vote for the same thing. So I wish I had an answer. That's the bottom line, is why don't people listen? And I think the real issue is that it's the same thing I witnessed in Venezuela when Chavez was coming into power. You know, people would say, it can't happen here. It can't happen here. And I saw the same thing here in Miami. Well, that's fine that we are now increasing our budget $1 billion for this city or this county. It doesn't matter that you're going to raise our taxes, that you're going to do these things, because that can't happen here. And I think that's the point, is that we as a society believe that everything is going to be okay and everything's going to stay the same, and then one day it's not. But at that point, as we've experienced, Cuba now has 63 years that they have not voted for anyone, and before that, that's probably a bad example anyways, because before that they had a dictator in Batista. But once you're in that position, you can't vote your way out. The only way out of an oppressive regime is fighting your way out.
That's right.
And so when it's at that point, it's too late.
You're so right with what you said about Venezuela and people saying it can happen here. But now people say the same thing in the United States.
Absolutely.
And, I'm a believer in American exceptionalism, but American exceptionalism doesn't mean that we're immune from problems. It means that we're exceptional because we're free. That doesn't mean that we're going to be free forever. We're only going to be free if we keep those freedoms. And I was in my university library a few months ago, and I was looking for books about Venezuela in New York. And I found a book that was titled Venezuela, Land of Opportunity from 1953. And they talked about the economy and all these things that were like in Venezuela. And that was the time that my grandparents immigrated to Venezuela from Europe. And they listed the salaries of different professions, the average salaries of different professions in Caracas in US dollars. And I wonder, how much did those professions pay in the 1950s in the United States? So I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. I looked up one of them was like secretary. A secretary made more money adjusted to US dollars in Caracas than in the United States. There were more cars per capita in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, than in New York City in the 1950s. That's how rich Venezuela was. Now, of course, the United States was much poorer in the 50s than it is today, but the point is the relative wealth. And so if it can happen in Venezuela, a country that was democratic, that was wealthy by international standards, that had political freedom, then why can't it happen here? It can happen anywhere. And Jorge's question was about communication. How can we communicate it? I want to bring up, it's not just about communication, it's about culture. And why do I want to bring up culture? Because socialism, at least my experience has told me, really comes from envy. And in Latin America, there is an epidemic of envy. There is an epidemic of hate towards success, while in America, we admire success.
I think that's changing, though. When I saw people wheeling a gulag, for example, Jeff Bezos for Amazon, you know that it's changed. It's changed.
Maybe, I think we've always had sectors here. We've had, for over 100 years, we tried to have an actual socialist party in the United States. And we had, big communist movement, and there's also people who don't believe in free markets on the right, too. But I think that the average American here believes much more in entrepreneurship and success and risk-taking than I think the average Latin American, in my experience, at least in Venezuela. And I think that that's something that we need to preserve, and we need to try to export. And that we can do it here, We can do it without government action, exporting entrepreneurship into Latin America. I think there should be more Americans trying to bring those things into Latin America. There should be more of an effort to try to help people in that way.
I mean, that would be great, but... So one of the points, though, that I think we missed on talking about Venezuela is that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. When you think about Saudi Arabia, when you think about these wealthy nations, it's important to know that Venezuela has more oil than them. Venezuela could live, obviously, hopefully not with the royal family, but they could have that amazing infrastructure and that all of those things that these countries have because they have these amazing oil reserves, because they have it.
Well, yeah.
And I lived in a city where oil was the main product in Maracaibo, and it's just so sad to see. And that is also part of socialism, where these people, these rulers who come into power will appoint their friends who don't know how to do things and don't know how to pull the oil up from the ground and don't know how to do it. So I think that's something to also look for here in the United States when we're talking about socialism is once you get into these positions of power, if they're appointing their friends that don't know how to work it, we've reached the starting point.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I want to build on what you two were talking about in the sense of the question of culture, the question of envy, the question of these political ideas, because they are really these political ideas are really the underlying causes of the policies that are implemented. Like when the policies are implemented in Latin America, socialist policies, they have to have a philosophical background. And in Latin America, it's exactly that. It's the idea that the economy is a zero-sum game in the sense that if some people are doing well, it's because others are doing badly. If some people have resources or opportunities, it's because they're taking it away from other people. And when, for example, Americans ask about the lessons that they can draw from the Venezuelan experience, one of them is that, for example, these anti-business narratives, these anti-millionaire narratives have to be pushed back from the beginning. Because the problem that, for example, of narratives such as Elizabeth Warren narrative, that inflation is caused by greed or by corporation. The problem is that if people really believe that, then the policy consequences are clear. People will advocate for a stricter business regulation. People will advocate for price controls. And people will advocate ultimately for the policies that end up resulting in, for example, scarcity or in all the problems that we are seeing in Latin America. So that's a key element, really. And that's why, again, these type of organizations, these type of conferences are so important. Because these ideas have to be communicated so that way they don't end up in policy.
Jorge, but just like there's, of course, there's people who say inflation is caused by greed, but there's also people who say that what happens in Venezuela is caused by sanctions.
Yeah.
Just like what happens in Cuba is caused by sanctions. And it's the same kind of myth that has nothing to do with reality.
And the interesting thing is that all the problems that we have in Venezuela, and this, we have to put it on the record, as you said, is that they precede the sanctions. Like the sanctions, the heavy sanctions were really implemented by Trump during 2017. And all the problems that Venezuela had come from the early 2010s. For example, we're in a recession since the third quarter of 2013. We have a scarcity since 2009, for example. But yeah, if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, of course,
Please.
you know, and I think that that's, you know, especially a lot of people who believe in free trade believe that that also means, well, you know, why don't we trade with the narco-trafficking leaders of the Venezuelan regime who own and control the companies? And I don't think that's free trade. That's actually just like if you were buying things from a criminal here, which would be illegal,
Right.
you know? And what happens is that first, there's a big misconception over what are the sanctions in place. People think that there's some kind of embargo in Venezuela. That's not true. Right now, if you guys want, we can go online and we can send food door to door in Venezuela, medicines too, anything you want. You can send cash, you can send, you know, Bitcoin, you can send, sell, anything you want. Yet, the regime has created this narrative that they're trying to infiltrate into both the left and also in libertarian movements in the United States, saying that it's the fault of America and that the best solution is that the US just needs to lift all sanctions and Venezuela is going to be better off. Venezuelans are going to be richer. And that's not true. In fact, the sanctions implemented by the Trump administration led to the liberalization of the economy of Venezuela. And today, there are no shortages in Venezuelan supermarkets because the regime was so isolated and the elite basically had no way to travel abroad that they said, we might as well end the shortages here. Even if people stay poor, at least they won't make lines, and I won't make lines either. So the ironic result was that the sanctions actually improved the quality of life of Venezuelans.
No, yeah, that's actually, yeah, please, do you want to comment on something?
That's absolutely true, and I think that's my #1 pet peeve when talking to libertarians about the issues of Venezuela and Cuba and, you know, so on. It's that sanctions sometimes are needed. The same happens with Cuba. People think that the sanctions on Cuba is why Cuba is having the issues that they have, and that's just not it. It is the cause of the regime. The sanctions don't necessarily cause this, and eliminating them won't fix the problem either. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, that's extremely important, and I have also been publishing a lot about it, because exactly, if the narrative then becomes that because of the US, is that countries like Venezuela are in poor conditions, then, which is exactly what all the leftist movements in other nations are pushing, is to basically say that their policies are not the real causes of the crisis. And again, all the data contradicts that. Basically, the humanitarian crisis that Venezuela is living began before the sanctions were implemented. And as you said, sanctions, if we really want to talk about it, they are policy instruments, they are tools. We should not see them from a moral perspective. Because in the case of Venezuela, for example, they are targeted towards the regime, towards the oligarchs, who basically took the money from the people, and now they have that money in banks in Europe, in houses here in Miami. And those are the things that we cannot allow as a free society, because as you said, free trade is free trade between good people, between good countries, under the law, under the rule of law. We cannot do trade the same way we cannot do business with criminals. So we have a few minutes, but I didn't want to leave this without asking you, Daniel. We touched also about the failures that, for example, governments like the Macri government had. And you, again, we're economists, from an economic perspective, what do you think is missing from our governments or our allies when we reach power? Why do you think we are not capable of producing efficient economic reforms that will bring prosperity, not just for a few, but actually will bring prosperity for everybody?
I think we miss courage. We miss boldness to do big reforms. It's just like people think that this is about, you know, raising or lowering, in Latin America at least, that this is about raising or lowering a little bit the taxes, you know, this little government spending and ministry. And the truth is that we need to totally change absolutely the government. And of course that requires, you know, parliamentary support, and that requires a lot of change, but some countries have been able to achieve it. You know, Panama is a very prosperous country today. Costa Rica is a very prosperous and peaceful country today. Chile used to be, though Chile achieved it in a non-democratic way. But we need big reforms. We need to massively reduce government spending in Latin America. We need to, honestly, some of these countries just need to eliminate their own currencies and dollarize their economies. They're just incapable of having monetary responsibility, and I think that's not a controversial thing to say. And in fact, the libertarians and the conservatives of those countries support dollarization. That's actually what saved Ecuador when the socialists came into power from going the way of Venezuela, because Rafael Correa didn't have the power to print money to finance government spending, and Ecuador therefore had stable inflation, 1% throughout his tenure. So we need those types of constraints that at the time socialists come into power, they can't even shake the prosperity of our countries. And we also need to learn from those experiences. You know, I touched on envy, but what's the opposite of envy? How do we combat that? We do it with gratefulness. In Venezuela, people were not grateful for what they had. That's the reality. Otherwise, they wouldn't have voted for Chavez, somebody who had been convicted and jailed. This was not some random person that just came up and was very charismatic. He had been in jail. How do people vote for a murderer? Yeah, you know, you said it's not that people are not stupid, but certainly they didn't think about it very much.
Colombia voted for a narco.
Yeah, now in Colombia they voted for an ex-guerrilla member.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it is about promoting gratefulness. I would like to promote something that I'm doing that I think it's part of that, and it's here in the United States, and that is the Dissident Project, where we're sending people who lived in socialist countries, including Latin America, of course, but also Asia and Europe and Africa, into high schools in the United States, so that kids in American high schools can learn from the first-hand experience of people who actually lived under socialism, learn that socialism is not the answer to our problems, that you can be on the left, you can be on the right, but you have to believe in the basics of property and free enterprise, regardless of whether you want a little or a little less welfare. And then that they understand that we need to be grateful to live in America, which is the best country in the world.
Yes, that's actually true. Yeah. So do you want to provide a 1-minute remark as well to the audience?
You know, I say that often. I am so grateful to live in this country, and it's not that we don't have problems, but it is the greatest country because we do have basic freedoms that you don't find necessarily everywhere, and that is why America was prosperous. It was those freedoms that allowed us. Oftentimes people will say, well, how come we don't have a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk or whoever you're an entrepreneur that you like, a John Mackey? Why don't we find them in Latin America? And it's not that there aren't super intelligent people all across Latin America. It is that they don't have the freedoms to do what they want to do. It is because in countries like Venezuela, even when it was not under Hugo Chavez, even before, you had to know the right people in order to work in the places. You had to have, we used to call it palanca. You have to have a palanca. You had to have, know somebody that can get you into that job. And in America, you don't need that. You just needed a good idea. And so freedom is my why. Freedom is everything. With freedom, you can achieve pretty much everything. And so I am blessed to live in this country, and let's keep it free.
Yes. And thank you. And since the two of you correctly said words of encouragement to Americans of why we need to fight for freedom, then let me finish with a slightly different type of angle, which is why should Americans also care about foreign affairs, international affairs, and specifically why they should care about Venezuela. The same way that in every generation, I think there is a moment that changes things, or there is a moment that shapes that generation. The same way that, for example, the Berlin Wall shaped for the better our parents' generation. I think what is going on in Ukraine, and what happened this year, is our own wake-up call. I think it's a change of paradigm. I think it really reflects that the world is changing, that the balance of power internationally is changing, and that if we, those who believe in freedom, and if America does not step up, then the next generation is going to be in really difficulties. If you see, for example, and if you study the Venezuelan case in detail, you will see how, for example, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, China, Turkey, how they work in synergy, how they work together to spread their totalitarian ideology and to also enhance their geoeconomic and geopolitical power. You see that, for example, in the energy sector, where the Iranians are cooperating with the Venezuelans. You see that for example, on the media, and how the Russians then work together with the other totalitarian regimes to spread misinformation. And you see it with the Chinese, when the way that they use their economic power then to move ahead and to try to colonize Latin America. If you see, for example, the investments from China, they go to specific countries with a specific type of regimes. So this is the wake-up call, what is going on in Ukraine. And I think what it tells us is that the fight for freedom is not tomorrow. The fight for freedom is not something that happened a generation ago. The fight for freedom, I think, is now. And I want to salute every single one of you who are here in this conference because it means that you care. It means that you care about the freedom of others. Never forget that when, for example, Daniel and I are talking about economic statistics, about economic growth or whatever, this actually means something. When we talk about millions of people that left Venezuela, 25% of our people had to leave the nation. But you know, 6 million people is a cold number. Just imagine every single one of the families who have been broken. Every single one of the families who now cannot gather in Christmas in a few months. That's the reality of why we are here. Never forget about it. Never forget that ideas, they matter, is because they change the life of people. And that's why I salute what you guys do. I salute everybody, and let's keep fighting, and let's win this battle.